In the fading light of a late November afternoon in 1944, the skies above Tokyo Bay remained eerily quiet. Lieutenant Toshio Sakagawa of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service scanned the horizon from his observation post at Yokosuka Naval Air Station. For weeks, intelligence reports had warned of a new American bomber threat, something far beyond the B-29 flying fortresses that had ravaged Germany but had yet to appear in significant numbers over the Japanese homeland. "They're coming," whispered the young radar operator beside him. "Multiple contacts. Bearing 170, distance 300 kilometers, and closing." The warning sirens began to wail across the naval base, and Sakagawa raced toward his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter. Within minutes, he was airborne alongside 11 other pilots from his squadron, climbing desperately to intercept whatever approached from the south. Japan's air defenses had been stretched thin by late 1944. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces had seen their best pilots whittled away through years of brutal attrition across the Pacific. Fuel shortages meant limited training for replacements, and critical aluminum shortages had reduced aircraft production. Yet the homeland defense remained the highest priority, with every available fighter concentrated to protect the Japanese home islands. As Sakagawa's formation passed through 25,000 feet, the aircraft began to struggle in the thin air. The Zero, masterful in low-altitude dogfighting, was reaching its operational ceiling. Through the scattered clouds ahead, silver dots appeared on the horizon. "My God," Sakagawa would later write in his diary, "they appeared like giant silver dragons, flying higher than I believed possible." What Sakagawa witnessed that day was America's newest strategic weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Unlike any bomber that came before it, the B-29 operated at altitudes often exceeding 30,000 feet, well beyond the effective combat ceiling of most Japanese interceptors. The formation approached in tight boxes, their polished aluminum skins gleaming in the high-altitude sunlight. Sakagawa pushed his Zero to its absolute limit, but the aircraft shuddered in protest as he approached 30,000 feet. His engine began running rough, and his controls felt sluggish. Looking up, he could see the B-29s cruising serenely, nearly 2 miles above his maximum effective ceiling. "We might as well have been throwing rocks," another pilot later remarked. The few Japanese fighters that managed to reach the B-29's altitude found their aircraft so performance-limited that they could barely maneuver. Their rifle-caliber machine guns lacked the range and hitting power to penetrate the B-29's armor at extended distances. The previous American bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, had been formidable, but they operated typically between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. Japanese pilots had developed tactics to intercept these aircraft when they appeared in limited numbers over Japanese-controlled territories. But the B-29 was a different beast entirely. With a wingspan of 141 feet and length of 99 feet, the Superfortress was substantially larger than previous bombers. Its 4 Wright R-3350 engines generated a combined 800 horsepower, allowing it to carry a bomb load of up to 20,000 pounds over distances unheard of in aerial warfare. But most critically, its pressurized cabin and turbo-supercharged engines enabled it to operate effectively above 30,000 feet, creating a nearly insurmountable tactical advantage. As that first formation passed overhead, Sakagawa and his fellow pilots could only watch as the B-29s methodically lined up their approach to targets in the Tokyo industrial area. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but their shells seemed to burst harmlessly below the bomber formation. "I fired until my ammunition was exhausted," Sakagawa recalled, "but I couldn't tell if I hit anything. They were simply too high." What made this new threat particularly alarming for Japanese defenders was the operational base of these bombers. Previous American air attacks had been limited by range constraints. But the B-29s attacking that day had taken off from the recently captured Marianas Islands, specifically from massive new airfields constructed on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These bases put all of Japan's major cities and industrial centers within range of American bombers for the first time. After the raid, as Sakagawa debriefed with his squadron commander, the severity of Japan's predicament became clear. Intelligence reports revealed that America was producing B-29s in unprecedented numbers. A single Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, was rumored to be completing a new superfortress every 24 hours. The Americans called their B-29 force the 20th Air Force, a designation that implied a massive expansion of their strategic bombing capability. "How do we fight such a bomber?" asked one young pilot during the debriefing. The squadron commander had no immediate answer. Traditional Japanese air defense doctrine had been built around agile fighters intercepting bomber formations, using their maneuverability to penetrate defensive fire and attack at close range. But when the bombers flew beyond the reach of your fastest fighters, these tactics became useless. Over the following weeks, Japanese engineers scrambled to modify their fighter aircraft. They stripped out armor, radios, and even some weapons to reduce weight, hoping to gain precious altitude performance. Some units began experimenting with air-to-air bombs and rockets that could be lobbed into bomber formations from below. But these improvisations yielded limited success. In the early months of the B-29 campaign, American bombers conducted mainly daylight, high-altitude precision bombing raids against aircraft factories, shipyards, and other industrial targets. The accuracy from such heights proved disappointing for American planners. But the Japanese inability to effectively intercept the bombers meant that losses remained acceptably low for the Americans. For Japanese pilots like Sakagawa, the psychological impact was perhaps as significant as the tactical challenge. The seemingly untouchable B-29s represented America's vast industrial superiority, a nation that could design, build, and deploy thousands of the most advanced aircraft in history, while Japan struggled to produce even basic fighters in sufficient numbers. "We called them B-san, Mr. B," wrote another Japanese pilot. There was a kind of grim respect. They appeared like silver gods, untouchable in the high atmosphere. By January 1945, the Japanese High Command had come to recognize the existential threat posed by the B-29. Emergency measures were implemented, including the creation of specialized high-altitude interception units equipped with the new Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki fighters, which could reach higher altitudes than the Zero. The Germans shared plans for rocket-powered interceptors, though Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. Anti-aircraft defenses were also reorganized, with batteries concentrated around major industrial centers and larger caliber guns modified for high-angle fire. Civil defense measures intensified, with civilians mobilized to clear fire breaks in major cities and create evacuation plans. Factory equipment was dispersed to reduce vulnerability to precision bombing. But these countermeasures would soon be tested against an even more terrifying evolution in American air strategy. By early 1945, a fundamental shift in B-29 tactics would render most Japanese defensive preparations obsolete. For Sakagawa, who had survived dozens of interception attempts against B-29s, the worst was yet to come. As he noted in his final diary entry of 1944, "They fly above us like gods. We stretch our fingers toward heaven, but they remain beyond our reach. I fear what will happen when they decide to descend from the heavens." The technological gap between Japanese defensive capabilities and the B-29's performance envelope was about to be exploited in ways that would transform the nature of strategic bombing and bring unprecedented destruction to the cities of Japan. America's silver giants, as Japanese civilians came to call them, were only beginning to demonstrate their full destructive potential. The B-29 superfortress wasn't born overnight. The story behind America's most sophisticated bomber began years before it would cast its shadow over Japanese cities. In 1939, as Europe descended into war, the United States Army Air Corps recognized an urgent need for a new long-range bomber capable of carrying substantial payloads across the vast distances of the Pacific. The war planners understood that if conflict with Japan came, America would need an aircraft that could strike from secure bases thousands of miles from the Japanese homeland. Boeing's engineers faced an unprecedented challenge. They weren't just designing an improved bomber, they were reimagining what an aircraft could be. Work began in earnest in 1940 with the first prototype, designated B-29, taking shape on drawing boards and in workshops outside Seattle. The aircraft would need to fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber before it, while carrying a bomb load capable of crippling industrial targets. The prototype that emerged was revolutionary, with a wingspan stretching 141 feet and a sleek, cylindrical fuselage extending 99 feet. The B-29 dwarfed earlier bombers. Its four massive Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 200 horsepower, gave the aircraft a top speed of over 350 miles per hour, faster than many fighters of the era. But these raw statistics only hint at the technological leap the B-29 represented. "This is a different beast entirely," remarked a test pilot after an early flight. "It's like comparing a Model T to a Cadillac." The program's scale was staggering. The final cost would reach approximately $3 billion, equivalent to about $43 billion in today's currency, making it the second most expensive weapons program of the war, surpassed only by the Manhattan Project. At its peak, over 1,000 subcontractors and suppliers were involved, and production facilities sprawled across the American heartland. Boeing's main plant in Wichita, Kansas, constructed specifically for B-29 production, employed over 30,000 workers, many of them women entering industrial work for the first time. Additional assembly lines operated in Renton, Washington and Marietta, Georgia, where Bell Aircraft and Martin built B-29s under license. The massive buildings housed assembly lines stretching hundreds of yards, with partially completed bombers advancing from station to station as thousands of components came together. "You couldn't see from one end of the factory to the other," recalled a former Boeing employee. B-29s in various stages of completion filled the space as far as the eye could see. Inside these cavernous facilities, a revolution in aircraft construction was taking place. While the B-29 size was impressive, its technological innovations truly set it apart. The most immediately noticeable feature was its pressurized cabin, the first in any production bomber. This allowed crews to operate without oxygen masks at altitudes above 20,000 feet, dramatically improving comfort and efficiency during long missions. The aircraft's defensive armament represented another leap forward. Previous bombers relied on crewmen physically manning gun positions distributed throughout the aircraft, exposing them to the freezing temperatures and thin air of high altitude. The B-29 introduced a centralized fire control system with remote-controlled gun turrets. A single gunner, seated at a console in the pressurized compartment, could operate multiple turrets using electrical controls and sophisticated analog computing sites. "The fire control system was something from science fiction," said a B-29 gunner. "You'd track a fighter through your sight, and the computer would calculate lead, range, and deflection automatically. The guns themselves might be 30 feet away, turning and firing on your target without you touching them." This system allowed for unprecedented accuracy in defensive fire while reducing crew vulnerability. 4 turrets, each containing 2 50-caliber Browning machine guns, covered all approaches to the aircraft. An additional turret in the tail housed two 50-caliber guns and a 20mm cannon in early versions. The entire system was interconnected, allowing gunners to hand off targets and coordinate fire against multiple attackers. The bomber's internal systems were equally advanced. The electrical system generated more power than many small towns of the era. Over 5 miles of wiring connected the various components, from the fire control computers to the engine superchargers. Hydraulic systems powered control surfaces and landing gear. The complexity demanded rigorous maintenance protocols and specialized training for ground crews. But building these technological marvels was only the first challenge. Training crews to operate them effectively required an equally massive effort. The B-29 typically carried a crew of 11 men: pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, radar operator, and 4 gunners. Each position required specialized training. At bases across the American Southwest, future B-29 crewmen underwent intensive instruction. Pilots faced particular challenges transitioning to the massive aircraft. The 4 enormous engines demanded precise management to prevent overheating, a persistent problem in early operations. The flight engineer operated a complex panel controlling superchargers, fuel mixture, and temperature for all engines, requiring coordination that resembled a dance between pilot and engineer. "Flying the B-29 wasn't like anything else," explained a former pilot. "You weren't just handling the controls, you were managing a system. The engineer was as essential as your own hands on the yoke." Navigation and bombing crews trained on sophisticated new equipment, including radar bombing systems that would allow them to strike through cloud cover, a crucial capability in the often overcast skies above Japan. Gunners spent hours in training turrets, tracking targets through their computerized sights and learning the intricacies of the remote control system. As crews and aircraft began to reach operational status in 1944, a unique command structure took shape to employ them. The 20th Air Force was established specifically for B-29 operations, reporting directly to General Henry Hap Arnold in Washington rather than through theater commanders in the Pacific. This unusual arrangement reflected the strategic importance placed on the bomber force and ensured that it would be employed according to long-range plans rather than immediate tactical needs. The final piece of the puzzle was establishing the forward bases from which the B-29s would strike. The aircraft's 250-mile range still required advanced bases closer to Japan than Hawaii or the continental United States. The solution emerged in the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, captured from Japanese forces in bitter fighting during the summer of 1944. On these islands, American construction battalions, the famous CBs, undertook one of the war's most impressive engineering feats. Working around the clock, they transformed volcanic terrain into massive airfields capable of supporting the heavy bombers. Each B-29 required approximately 40,000 square feet of concrete hardstand, and dozens would need to be accommodated at each base. 6 airfields were eventually constructed, featuring the longest runways built up to that time. Tinian alone would eventually house 4 massive airfields with a total of 6 runways. The island was essentially converted into an immense aircraft carrier, with nearly its entire surface dedicated to supporting the bombing campaign. "When we first landed, there was nothing but jungle and bomb craters," recalled a CB. 6 months later, it looked like an industrial complex had been dropped from the sky. B-29s were parked wingtip to wingtip as far as you could see. Supply chains stretched thousands of miles to support the operation. Each B-29 mission consumed approximately 800 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, delivered by tankers navigating submarine-infested waters. Bombs, spare parts, maintenance equipment, and provisions for tens of thousands of personnel, All had to flow continuously to maintain operations. By late 1944, the pieces were in place. The Marianas-based B-29s of Shikoku Bomber Command began striking targets in Japan with increasing frequency. Early missions brought mixed results as crews battled mechanical problems, unfamiliar weather patterns, and the challenges of high-altitude precision bombing. But the very presence of these silver giants in Japanese skies signaled a fundamental shift in the war. For the first time, American bombers were striking the Japanese homeland regularly and with impunity. The Japanese fighter pilot, who had watched helplessly as the first B-29s passed overhead, could not have known the full scale of the industrial miracle that produced them, nor the strategic vision that deployed them. But as the bombing campaign intensified in the opening months of 1945, both he and his nation would soon face the full consequences of America's most ambitious aerial weapon. March 1945 brought a dramatic shift in the American bombing strategy over Japan. The night of March 9th would be forever seared into the memory of Lieutenant Toshio Matsumura as he stood on the roof of the command post near Tokyo. The familiar drone of B-29s approaching had become routine in recent months, but something was different this time. The bombers were coming in much lower than ever before, their engines growling with unmistakable aggression as they approached at just 5,007 feet. "They're practically on the deck," Matsumura murmured to his squadron mate. "What are they thinking?" What Matsumura was witnessing was the implementation of General Curtis LeMay's radical tactical shift. Frustrated by the limited success of high-altitude precision bombing against Japanese industrial targets, LeMay had made a controversial decision. The B-29s would now fly at lower altitudes, at night, carrying incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. The change stripped the superfortresses of their defensive armament to carry more bombs, removed the gunners except for the tail position, and exploited Japan's vulnerable wooden cities. As Matsumura scrambled to his Nakajima Ki-44 fighter, the sky above Tokyo was already glowing an unnatural orange. From his cockpit, he could see the first waves of B-29s methodically dropping their payloads of E-46 incendiary clusters and M69 napalm bombs. Each bomber released around 40 clusters, with each cluster separating into 38 individual bomblets. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. "The Americans have changed tactics," Matsumura radioed to base. "They're coming in low, under our high-altitude defenses." By morning, 16 square miles of Tokyo lay in smoldering ruins. The raid, conducted by 334 B-29s, had killed more than 100. Zero people in a single night, more than either atomic bombing would claim months later. Matsumura landed his fighter at dawn, his fuel nearly depleted after multiple unsuccessful intercept attempts. The city he had sworn to defend was now a landscape of charred timber and twisted metal. LeMay's tactical revolution had exploited every weakness in Japanese air defense. The low-altitude approach negated the high-altitude fighters and anti-aircraft batteries positioned for conventional raids. The night attacks minimized visual interception. Most devastatingly, the incendiary payloads were perfectly calibrated for Japan's largely wooden urban construction. "We must adapt or perish," declared Colonel Yasuhiko Kuroi at the emergency staff meeting Matsumura attended the following day. The Japanese Air Defense Command scrambled to develop countermeasures. Fighter pilots were trained in nighttime interception tactics despite the critical fuel shortages that limited practice flights. Searchlight batteries were repositioned to create better illumination corridors. Radar operators worked exhausting shifts trying to provide earlier warnings. One desperate tactic emerged from the growing fatalism in the ranks: ramming. The practice of Tai-Atari, deliberately crashing into enemy aircraft, became officially sanctioned. Matsumura watched as younger pilots were indoctrinated into these missions with promises of honor and spiritual significance. "Your aircraft becomes your weapon," an instructor told new recruits at Matsumura's base. "One B-29 destroyed is worth the sacrifice." Meanwhile, specialized night fighter units equipped with radar-equipped Ki-61 and Ki-45 aircraft were formed. Though plagued by technical limitations and training shortfalls, the special attack units, better known as kamikaze, previously reserved for naval targets, began considering the B-29 formations as objectives. As spring turned to summer in 1945, LeMay's firebombing campaign systematically erased Japan's urban centers from the map. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, one by one they burned. The B-29s came with clockwork regularity, their bomb bay doors opening over new targets each night. Japanese interceptor pilots like Matsumura increasingly found themselves defending cities that were already partially destroyed from previous raids. "Our anti-aircraft batteries are down to 10 rounds per gun," Matsumura overheard at a briefing in June. Ammunition shortages were compounded by production disruptions as the bombing campaign struck manufacturing centers. Aluminum alloys for fighter production became scarce. Aviation fuel, already strictly rationed, became so precious that training flights were virtually eliminated. For Japanese civilians, the psychological impact was devastating. Air raid sirens wailed almost nightly in major cities, sending millions into inadequate shelters. Factory production fell as workers, exhausted from nights in shelters and days clearing rubble, struggled to maintain output. Food distribution networks frayed as transportation infrastructure was targeted. "The people still believe in victory," a military censor told Matsumura when he inquired about civilian morale, "but they wonder when our fighters will stop these B-29s." The truth was, the Japanese air defense network was collapsing under the strain. Radar stations operated intermittently due to power outages and equipment failures. Communication lines were repeatedly severed by bombing. Fighter units were consolidated as losses mounted and replacements dwindled. Pilots like Matsumura flew increasingly obsolete aircraft against an enemy growing more confident with each mission. By July 1945, B-29s operated over Japan with near impunity. Beyond the direct bombing campaign, the superfortresses had launched another equally devastating operation that received far less attention: aerial mining. Operation Starvation deployed thousands of naval mines dropped by B-29s in shipping lanes around Japan. The mining campaign choked off maritime supply routes, isolating the island nation from critical resources and accelerating its economic collapse. "The coal shipments from Hokkaido have stopped completely," an intelligence officer reported. "Steel production is down to 15% of last year's output." The ripple effects touched every aspect of Japanese defense production, from ammunition to aircraft parts. Matsumura experienced the consequences firsthand. His squadron's serviceability rate plummeted as replacement parts became unobtainable. After one sortie in late July, he returned to find maintenance crews cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep others flying. "We're taking guns from crashed fighters to arm the operational ones," his crew chief explained. "The factory deliveries have stopped." The technological gap between the B-29 and its Japanese opponents had always been vast, but now it was unbridgeable. In a rare opportunity, Matsumura was called to examine recovered parts from a downed B-29 in early August. Standing before the twisted remains of the Central Fire Control System, with its sophisticated analog computer and remote turret controls, he finally grasped the full extent of America's industrial and technical advantage. "How many years would it take us to develop something like this?" he asked the engineering officer conducting the examination. "With our current resources?" The officer laughed bitterly. "Perhaps never." What impressed Matsumura most wasn't any single feature, but the integration of systems. The way the B-29 combined pressurization, electronics, engines and armament into a cohesive whole. Each component represented manufacturing precision beyond Japan's current capabilities. The Boeing engineers had solved problems Japanese aviation experts were still theorizing about. By August, Tokyo's Air Defense Command acknowledged the grim reality in classified assessments. They could no longer effectively counter the B-29 threat. Japan's once formidable air defense network had been systematically dismantled by a combination of technological superiority, tactical innovation, and sheer industrial might. The Americans had achieved what military theorists called air superiority in its most complete form. The skies above Japan belonged to the superfortress, and particularly to the transformed weapon General LeMay had fashioned from Boeing's technological marvel. What had begun as a high-altitude precision bomber had evolved into the most devastating area bombing platform in history. For Matsumura and the remaining Japanese interceptor pilots, each mission became increasingly futile, symbolic resistance against an unstoppable force. They were witnessing the culmination of industrial warfare on a scale Japan had never anticipated when it awakened the American industrial giant in December 1941. And as July turned to August, none of them yet realized that the B-29's most terrible mission was still to come. By July 1945, the skies over Japan had become the sole domain of the B-29 superfortress. For Lieutenant Takeshi Noguchi, who had once flown confidently in his Kawanishi N-1K Shiden fighter, the situation had become an exercise in futility. The Japanese Home Defense Air Force existed now in name only, with fuel reserves critically depleted and experienced pilots dwindling to a precious few. We would receive scramble orders, but often couldn't even take off, Noguchi would later recall in a post-war interview. When we did manage to get airborne, the B-29s were either gone or too numerous to effectively engage. They owned our skies completely. The technological supremacy of the B-29 became starkly evident to Noguchi in early July when he was summoned to a maintenance hangar outside Tokyo. There, laid out in components, was the salvaged wreckage of a downed superfortress. Engineers from Nakajima Aircraft Company were methodically documenting every piece, measuring and photographing the components with reverent attention. It was the first time I had seen the aircraft up close, not through a gun sight or distant in formation, Noguchi said. The size alone was shocking. The propellers were taller than most men. But it was the sophisticated systems that left us in awe. The Japanese technicians pointed out features that represented technological leaps beyond anything in the imperial arsenal. The central fire control system with its analog computer for calculating deflection shooting, the remote-controlled gun turrets that eliminated the drag of conventional blisters, the sophisticated APQ-13 radar bombing system that allowed precision targeting through cloud cover, the fully pressurized cabin that enabled crew comfort at extreme altitudes. One engineer, who had worked on the design of the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate fighter, simply shook his head when examining the B-29's Wright R-3350 engines with their fuel injection systems and turbo superchargers. "We cannot match this," he reportedly said. "Not with current resources, not with current knowledge." For Noguchi and other pilots, this glimpse behind the curtain of American aeronautical superiority was sobering. The B-29 represented not just a better aircraft, but an entirely different generation of aviation technology, supported by America's vast industrial base. Meanwhile, the 20th Air Force continued its relentless campaign. By August 1945, General Curtis LeMay's bomber force had essentially run out of major industrial targets. 66 Japanese cities had experienced significant bombing, with urban areas reduced to rubble and ash. The once mighty Japanese aircraft industry had been dispersed to caves, schools, and small workshops, a desperate attempt to maintain even minimal production. The mining campaign, codenamed Operation Starvation, had proven devastatingly effective. B-29s had sown more than 12 Zhuozhuran mines in shipping channels and harbour approaches, sinking or damaging over 250 ships and reducing Japan's maritime shipping capacity by 90%. Islands that once received 700 tons of supplies monthly now received barely 50 tons. "We were being strangled," recalled Noguchi. Each week brought new restrictions. Military rations were cut again and again. Aircraft fuel became so precious that we preserved it drop by drop. This strangulation extended to every aspect of Japanese military capability. Anti-aircraft batteries rationed shells, radar sites operated intermittently to save electricity, and fighter units consolidated as numbers dwindled. The technological gap that had been evident from the B-29's first appearance had only widened as Japan's industrial capacity collapsed. Then came August 6, 1945. The single B-29 that appeared over Hiroshima that morning seemed unremarkable. Japanese air defense had grown accustomed to small formations of superfortresses conducting reconnaissance or weather flights. The flash that followed and the mushroom cloud that rose above the city signaled that American technological superiority had entered a terrifying new phase. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb devastated Nagasaki. The B-29, already Japan's aerial nightmare, had become the delivery system for a weapon beyond Japanese comprehension. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, Noguchi and his fellow pilots listened in stunned silence. Their courage and skill had proven insufficient against an enemy whose technological and industrial advantage had grown insurmountable. In September 1945, as occupation forces arrived in Japan, American B-29s began appearing in peaceful formation flights over Tokyo and other cities. Japanese citizens who had cowered from these aircraft now watched them with a mixture of fear, resignation, and curiosity. Technical evaluation teams from America's Army Air Forces interviewed Japanese aircraft designers and engineers about their wartime experiences. These interviews revealed how completely Japanese aviation experts had understood their technological disadvantage. The B-29 program cost more than the Manhattan Project that built the atomic bomb, explained Colonel Paul Tibbets during a post-war press conference. America spent approximately $3 billion developing this aircraft, more than any weapon system in history up to that point. That level of commitment created an aircraft that was simply beyond anything the Japanese could counter. For Japanese aviation engineers, the technical details of the B-29 provided valuable lessons that would influence post-war development. The aluminum alloys, electrical systems, pressurization techniques and engine innovations would eventually find their way into Japanese civilian aircraft designs during the country's economic recovery decades later. In a striking historical footnote, several captured B-29s were extensively studied by Soviet engineers after forced landings in the Russian Far East. These aircraft became the basis for the Tupolev Tu-4 Bull bomber, a reverse-engineered copy that gave the Soviet Union its first strategic bombing capability. Lieutenant Noguchi returned to civilian life after the war, eventually working as a flight instructor for Japan's newly established civilian airlines in the 1950s. During his training, he had the opportunity to inspect American aircraft up close and speak with American pilots about their wartime experiences. What struck me most was the contrast in our approaches, Noguchi reflected in a 1975 interview. We had emphasized pilot skill and spirit to overcome technical disadvantages. The Americans had instead created a technical advantage so overwhelming that even the most skilled pilot couldn't overcome it. The B-29 taught Japan a harsh lesson about modern warfare. that industrial capacity and technological advancement ultimately matter more than individual heroism. Today, preserved B-29 superfortresses can be found in aviation museums worldwide. In Japan's defense museums, diagrams and photographs of the aircraft are displayed alongside accounts of the firebombing campaigns and atomic attacks, a somber reminder of the devastating impact this single aircraft type had on the nation. For the generation of Japanese who experienced the war, the distinctive silhouette of the B-29 against the sky remained etched in memory, the unmistakable shape of American industrial might that had turned the tide of the Pacific War and brought an empire to its knees.